today I want to go through a video, a bit of a technical video, explaining how I make a rifle make it shoot more accurately. But what I'm actually talking about is how I make the rifle actually cycle, or through its recoil process, that the rifle comes as straight backward and forwards as possible. Now, I suppose I'd start by explaining why that is. And it is because, regardless of what some people might think, the barrel starts moving before the bullet leaves, and through various processes, including muzzle brakes, actually can start to make the barrel move before the bullet actually leaves, because the gas that's in front of the bullet is pushed out and starts to make your muzzle brake actually do things, to the fact that the shock that causes the rifle to react is travelling up the barrel. The whole rifle is going through the process as the bullet is travelling. So it means that when your rifle bucks, and keep in mind, if it does exactly the same thing every time, it doesn't matter, you're still going to shoot accurately. But if the barrel is starting to move upwards and you're not completely consistent, because you're a human, and from the amount the rifle moves, how fast it moves and all that sort of stuff changes as to how you're preloaded, how the conditions, how the bipod operates, everything else, it means that you then get inconsistencies because that movement is different from shot to shot. So what that comes down to, if you're exactly the same every time, you don't need to worry about any of it, but if you're a normal human, then it matters. The more consistent you can make, the flatter shooting you can make the rifle, the less your inconsistencies are going to affect how the bullet travels. So with that process, in trying to make that cycle backwards and forwards as straight as possible, there are a fair few things involved. Starts from whether it's a muzzle brake or not muzzle brake, and your muzzle brake, how that affects things. That is one of the things. Your bipod and how that works, or your front rest system, whether it's a bipod or it's a bag or it's a whatever it is, affects things. The shape of your chassis, the structure of your chassis, that affects things. The butt pad height, the whole back of the stock affects things. All those things affect things, and of course, the more powerful the round, the lighter the rifle, all things that make the rifle move more affect things as well. If you have a great big heavy 30 kilo or 60 pound rifle, then you'll find it needs to be far less correct in all its fashions when you're only shooting a lighter bullet, and vice versa. If you have a 10 pound 300 or 338 Lapua and it's only a 10 pound rifle, although that can still function properly, it needs to be far more accurately built to be an accurate rifle. And by and large, a bit heavier makes things easier, but all the rules still apply. So I'll break it down. I'll probably do a separate one on bipods, so that I'll put a separate video, which I'll put a link on here, to go through with bipods and explain bipods in particular. But in this one I'll go through the basics of bits and pieces. Like I said, starts with the muzzle brake. Well, for this conversation, starting muzzle brake. Muzzle brake does certainly help. It reduces the recoil, makes things nicer to shoot. But it also can cause problems. As I said, the bullet actually, there's a charge of gas that's trapped in front of your bullet. When it goes bang, that gas is pushed out at as fast as that bullet's travelling. That means that gas hits the muzzle brake, and the muzzle brake will start to do things. So, and they first found out this sort of stuff when they started to put snipers behind big rifles with muzzle brakes, the likes of the 50 cal or the 50 BMG, and found that there were some shooters that really struggled to get them on target. Other shooters did okay. When they analysed that, go through the process of it, the guys who had a better form and a better setup, which meant that when the muzzle brake did its wriggle, of actually causing a shock going through the gun, the guys who were better set up with a better form did a better job than the guys that weren't. But what we really want is, we don't want our muzzle brake to be messing with things. We don't want our muzzle brake to be doing anything other than helping. So in that format, there's a few things in a muzzle brake design, and I've got videos on those, but not a muzzle brake that gives you good recoil reduction. But for a well set up rifle, you do not want one with ports up, down, or anything other than, well, if you do have up and down ports, then they've got a radial one where we're all over the place. But really, in my way of doing things, for ELR shooting at least, I just have the gas going to the side and no upwards or downwards ports. The reason for that is, and I suppose I should go what I'm really talking about there, you'll find a lot of muzzle brakes that have some ports in the top of the muzzle brake, and those ports, some of them are tunable, so you can take more or less out, but they're to stop muzzle rise. And I understand that there's places where they sort of work, but and tuning them gets them better and all that sort of stuff, but you have to understand something in a basic engineering term. If you've got something that's actually forcing the front of the barrel down, and it needs it, it means something at the other end is forcing the barrel up. So if those ports when the rifle was going up, well, you know, you're in one sense you're making it shoot flat and sit straight by having these ports that are pushing it down. But in another sense, an analogy I used recently, if you've got a car wheel, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and they need balancing or they vibrate, and I'm sure you've all been through that process. If you've got a bad tyre that's got a big heavy fat piece on it, and you fix that by putting a whole heap of weights on it, you never end up, and if you've ever been through that process, you'll realise you never end up with a real fix. You're running a compromise, because the tyre's no good. It's an out of balance tyre. It needs chucking in the bin. A good tyre on it, less weights, you're in a better situation. And it's a lot more complex than that, but that's the basics of it. Well, the same thing's going on. If you were actually using ports to stop it muzzle rising at the front, because the actual rifle setup's making the muzzle rise, what's actually happening, and you could go through and set up super high speed cameras and see this, but to actually make that shoot flat, if in that situation, you're actually bending things. You're actually pushing it up, so, you know, in other words, you have a bend happening in the middle through that process. So a lot more aggressive process, and although you'll make it work okay, you're putting a band-aid on a band-aid, or you're putting a band-aid on a problem rather than fixing the problem. So my advice would always be, your rifle should shoot largely straight with no muzzle brake, or with a dead even muzzle brake it should shoot straight. If it's not, then putting ports in the top of it is not the proper fix. The proper fix is working to where your problem is down the back here. And that includes people who just put weight on their rifle. Yes, you'll stop it from jumping off the ground, you'll stop a little bit of what's going on, but you'll find the problem is still there, and it's still causing, although maybe less visible and noticeable jumping, you still have a problem that needs to be cured. So, to finish what I got to say at muzzle brakes, I don't think that having ports in the top is the right fix. In some places you have no choices, but you stop. But largely, if you can set things up when you don't need them, you're a better place. The other bit about muzzle brakes and making them shoot well is making sure that you don't want the ones that are shoving the percussion in your face, so they're hard to shoot, that sort of stuff. So proper shielding, proper setup. My brakes do a good job of not doing that sort of stuff. They're also designed so a radial brake does a good job, when they're full radial, good job off a bench and that sort of stuff, because they're very even. I don't like them. I shoot prone, and dust off the ground is a real mess from them, so these work well for this. Not so pleasant to shoot alongside, because if you're just alongside you get a lot of punch over there, but for the shooter and the spotter and everyone in this nice little cone of silence, not that it's silence but of protection, they're very nice to shoot with. Anyway, that's muzzle brakes. The bipod side of things, I'll go through and do it properly, but the main thing I would say about a bipod is I want to see this action here. That rocking, it's very important to me. And the simple logic for that is that I go from a preload position to when it goes back, you know, through its firing process, and obviously it'll go right back on a full recoil, but by the time the bullet's left, it's only come back probably, and I've never measured it, but it's probably half an inch of travel you're really looking at by the time the bullet's left. So having that little rock there means that in the basics of it, a fairly long leg means that arc of pivot point, I'll do that like that arc of pivot point, there's very little up and down movement in that process, and the less movement you have, even though there's going to be some, it's in the thou. But if it's, and keep in mind that your preload side of things can vary, because we're humans and we don't have a dial indicator on our shoulder. That means that if there's a tiny bit of difference, the arc has almost no difference to it. So the longer the leg, the more that is. Obviously there's other things, and I'll go through it. This is a factory rifle. It's had my little tweaks to it, but it's the factory TRG. This is their bipod. The only thing I've done is put a lock-up system in it, which is just modified the screw in the front so it locks up, which is also very important. I don't want to be a rifle that's flopping around you're having to hold all the time. Yes, it sort of works, but it takes a lot off the brain, a lot of everything. If you can lock it up in your position and you check it, and then your focus can simply be on getting yourself in the right place, getting everything in the right gear, breathing to trigger to everything else where it works, and you don't have to be focusing on holding the thing up all the time. So that's bipod. Like I said, I'll do a lot more comprehensive thing about bipods, but that's the basics there. As we come back down the rifle, then the weight is certainly a factor, like I said. And to a degree, weight can be used as a simple band-aid to a fairly excessive level, and I think in some places too far. But yeah, you know, you can take a 308 and make it weigh 50 kilos and the damn thing hardly moves. There's not really any negatives apart from moving the frickin' thing. To me, it becomes, once you got too heavy, you're moving away from being a rifleman and from being accurate what you're doing. You're moving more into a railgun is a bad term for it, but where you have a solid mechanical thing that's adjusted on the bench and you just use a stick to poke the trigger. Now it's not really being a rifleman. So there's a weight, there is some concept, there is some logic to it, but it's not. It is a bit of a. It can be used as a band-aid, like I said. What I try and go with is I do want moderate weight, and I probably, for me, a really accurate 308, 65 Creedmoor, that sort of stuff is moving into around the 15 pounds. Is 15 to 18 pounds is fairly heavy by a very precision gun, and it still makes sense. It's a pick up carry sort of thing, but it's a nice sort of weight which I like to work with as a dressed gun. This, the 308 Lapua, then we're moving into the sort of 20 pounds, 21 pounds, not 18 to 22 pounds sort of makes sense for me, but that's a personal thing. And when I go to the bigger ones, then going up into the 30 pounds or 28 pounds, I think is what my 375 weighs. It makes sense, just makes it a little bit easier, and it sort of makes sense for what the rifle is. The main thing I want in it, apart from a little bit of balance, so that it does feel balanced, it sits on the ground in more balanced form. Weight in the front, weight in the back sort of makes sense. It puts weight over its bipod, it's even the way it sits the ground a bit easier, makes it easier to preload and that sort of stuff. You've got enough weight in the front, makes it easier for it sitting down the back in its bag if it's got some weight down the back. But is rigidity. One of the things that actually happens, and I'll talk about the whole back end now so we're making sense of it, is that your bang is obviously going, as per Newton's law, in the opposite direction to where the bullet's going. So basically, this has got a nice little pin where you can see your firing pin, or the back of the action, or back of the bolt here. That little point there is exactly where the load is actually coming from. Now, to get from there to the bit that's actually pushing it, your shoulder, you need to have this up to a certain point. If you had this down to nice and flat, which sort of how most rifles are set up, and the cheek rest was lower and all the rest of it, once you get that down and you're pushing down here, then you can see that line of push to where your normal shoulder position is, means that there's a point where that push is going to push the whole rifle up. Simple as that. Simple lever point back here. And equally, if you go too high and push up here, you're going to push the muzzle down. And in some places that's what people are doing because they've got other problems. Unless your push line is straight, you're going to induce movement, bending of the rifle, bouncing of the rifle, something or other. Both high and low, you're going to induce that problem. Equally, if you have this perfect and you have a flex going here where the back of the stock or the chassis or wherever it is bending through that process. As it gets pushed hard here because it's being pushed hard here, or as it's being pushed by the rifle and your shoulder's pushing against the point of the back here, if there's flexibility in the middle here, then you get this movement. You've got the same thing going on. You can have all this perfect and all this perfect, and if here's a problem, or anywhere through that drive, really through obviously your bolts, where your action bolts down is through this point here. Anywhere through this point here that has to take the load, that can't get it delivered straight to the back here without flexing, it's going to cause you issues. So That moves into some of the plastic stocks with the AR buffer tubes and bits and pieces like that have down the back there. Bits of movement, the way they're designed, quite commonly you'll even see on quite a few chassis where the adjustment point for the butt pad doesn't have a strong enough leverage point, and you'll actually see some bending in it as it happens. It doesn't, and it's only to a degree you'll see these problems, but once again, the higher the caliber, the more the punch, the more this becomes an issue. You can see this one here drops down through here. What I did in making this stronger is I placed this bar through here when I'm running heavy loads in this to try and stop a little bit of flexing that I felt was happening through here. But it's all about the design of trying to make sure that there isn't that inclination for your pressure on the back here to raise the front. And like I said, or vice versa, in the way of lowering the front. But that's a very important point. I'll talk a little bit more, that rigidity through there. Obviously what I like to run, as I've modified this one and put a bag right on the back here, I like to have that horizontal. So that as this cycle happens, as that backwards and forwards actually happens, it's straight. Everything is traveling straight. It's also important to keep in mind that on your bag, that when you're actually shooting, what accuracy is you pack things down properly. One of the things that I use my adjustable bag base to make sure that I adjust the squeezing of a bag to squeeze it up, that squeezing, which is the way we're all taught, the way we're taught to use a sandbag and that sort of stuff, it's still, if you keep it completely consistent, it'll work the same way. But when it goes bang, your shoulders in here, you get a bit of a sandwich thing going on, which means that quite commonly, the way most people are set up, the buttstock is naturally going to push down a little bit. If you're squeezing this up with the hand and then shooting it, it's going to be coming back down. So it gives you a stable trigger position for when you actually pull, but when it goes bang, it's going to sink in the back. And the same if you have an angle back on the stock here. As much as that's nice for being able to move forward and back to change your elevation, you have this cycle, which means that, or this angle, which means that as it goes bang, it's coming down. And once again, if you're completely consistent, that isn't an issue. But if you're a normal human and you're not completely consistent, you're going to find a different level of dropping, which then you'll find in a lot of cases vertical stringing will happen in that place. So I prefer to have the straight down the back here, so it cycles, make sure it's compacted properly, and it's there. And sometimes you'll be 3 or 4 shots before it's packed properly. I tend to like to push it down as I set up and make sure it's as stable as possible. And like I said, I have my adjustable bag base, which means that I raise my ground, essentially. I raise the whole base to keep it compacted the whole time. Okay, so that's the basics of down the back there. Want that straight, want that line of push straight, and want a bag rider so I can slide backward and forward, want a compacted bag. As we come back to here, one of the things that I don't speak about much, I haven't sort of gone back across it because it's something that I do automatically, and people that shoot around me, the likes of Sam, the likes of other people, sort of already know this, so I haven't said it enough out loud probably, is I shoot on my collarbone. I don't use the shoulder pocket. No, your collarbone's not going to snap. You've got a problem if it does. It doesn't have, that's where I shoot. So it's actually on my collarbone. There's a few logics to it, and I find a few negatives to shooting on the in the shoulder pocket. When you're shouldering a rifle and you're holding it up, then the shoulder pocket is certainly in play. That's how you use it, that's how you stand, that sort of stuff. But in a prone position, I go away from that for a few reasons. I go to my collarbone, and yes, even the 50 BMG to the really hard hitting horrible ones to all sorts of stuff, there's no issue. It doesn't break anything, doesn't hurt anything. It can be a sharper pressure point sometimes, but I don't find any issues whatsoever. And even my little mate, my little spotter Sam, shoots the same way and doesn't have any issues either. She ends up with more of a little red mark there after a day of being out shooting, but there's no damage and nothing that's bruising or anything like that. The reason I use the collarbone, there's a couple of things, like I said. To one, the shoulder pocket seems like a nice sort of place to dig something in. To me, it isn't an even place. It's quite a large area that's in there, and it's your shoulder bone or the side of your collarbone things. There's different pressures you can be putting on, and you tend to find stocks that are trying to angle, or you can adjust some to try and angle into this spot to try and get that groove right. I found that needlessly complicated, and potentially, I didn't do any testing to go with it, I'll be completely honest, but potentially it's going to cause different pressure points on the back of the rifle, which is going to cause it to either twist or shoot a little bit and basically more erratic. Coming to the collarbone, there's a nice straight little bar here. That straight little bar can go right here, which means then I can position my setup so my collarbone is right where I want it to be. It's pushing right to that line. Lift this up, and I mentioned this now, is that the height of this doesn't matter if your push point's in the wrong place. Your push point, in my case collarbone, has to be in this place, which is a lot easier to work out, and for me a lot easier to function with my collarbone. The other logic, and the real logic I first went to the collarbone, is I'm a stiff old bugger. I don't like flexing, twisting, laying in uncomfortable positions. I want to get in a place where from my chest off the ground, I'm not squished down, I'm not bending my neck too much, I'm not tilting my head over too much. I want everything to be fairly natural in my format. I use I've been through videos on that, a strong triangle structure, using my bone structure to lay on, and then I don't want my head tilted over or twisted around or moved to the wrong places. By going to my collarbone, I found it very natural to be in the collarbone. It keeps my everything a lot straighter. In some cases I have to do some more work and get my the cheek rest over or out of the road to make sure that I can get my head to the right place, and I tend to run my scope higher. Causes no issues for people who are concerned about that. Higher scope doesn't cause any issues in the way of your elevation, and you can check it out on your ballistic calculators and figure it all out. But I really want to get it to up into the height where I can keep everything straighter and taller. The other little key of getting the scope up higher is it naturally tends to be putting my collarbone to a better place on the back here, and that's where I want my collarbone. I want it straight in line so that everything shoots straight. So I think that's probably complicated enough. Muzzle brake that is only helping with reducing recoil, bipod that is trying to help things go as straight back and forward as possible, a chassis system, a stock system, whatever it is that is rigid and going to transfer my drive straight down to where my butt plays in the right place and where my pressure point is directly in line with everything, with a compacted bag that's running with the bag rider that everything can go straight forward and back, is one of my major things that I do to make a rifle shoot well. I do very little load development. My load development on my bullet is about pressure and making sure I've got the pressure to the right place. The main place I do a lot of work on is making sure that the rifle shoots very flat. And one of the first things I do in setting up a rifle is videoing it. We're obviously always videoing everything. I slow it down. I get the proper sideways footage, even if it's just on your iPhone, and slow it down, even if you're just using iPhone software or smartphone software. But actually have a look at that and see what's going on. What can appear really good can actually have a nasty little wriggle in it. The naked eye won't tell you that sometimes. If it's not jumping right up, it still might have a nasty little wriggle in it, and that wriggle is always induced by something. So muzzle brakes can be a classic one of doing it, but equally butt pad, all that chassis, all the things that I spoke about can cause this issue, and it's really diagnosing that I find where most of my consistency comes from. Anyway, that's a talk about that. I'll go through another video and go through more comprehensively about bipods. Yeah, hope that was of some help to some people, and thanks for checking in on us. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Down below here we've got a link to our web store where we have some of the specialised long-range shooting products that we actually produce. Check them out.
And for those of you who can, it'd be great to get some help. In our store we have support bits, and when you purchase those, the money goes direct to our channel and helps us bring these videos to you.
Thanks, guys.
See you next time.